Told Brother Jim, are you ready to preach tonight? You notice he's still sitting out there. No, I'll be fair to him. I kind of gave him late notice, didn't I, Jim? Have you ever read the Bible and there's times when you read a passage and you're like, what? Or you read it and you say, I don't like that verse very much. Or you read that verse and say, awesome, love it. Well, tonight I want to share from Philippians chapter 1, okay? But before you get there, I want you to turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 12, okay? I want you to go to 2 Corinthians chapter 12, and I'd like for you to look at verse 10, okay? I want you to hear what probably, in my opinion, one of the greatest writers in the history of this world. Yes, he was inspired by God, but he was also willing to be used by God, and that is the Apostle Paul. And here in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 10, listen to what this verse says. This is one of these verses I'm like, really? Okay. All right, listen to what it says. It says, therefore I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in deeds, in persecutions, in distresses, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. How many of you can say you have a true thorn in the flesh? And I don't mean the person sitting next to you. Okay? I want you to think about infirmities. Some of you are like, nobody sitting next to me. Whew. I want you to think about infirmities for a moment. I want you to think about ailments for a moment. As most of you know that I had cancer. I don't even remember now how long ago it was. My daughter was just born, Hannah. And you know, when someone walks in the room and they say you have cancer, you have a lot of thoughts that run through your mind, but none of them are usually pleasant thoughts. And I can remember that. I can remember clearly that day. I can remember the doctor walking in and saying something to me. I can also remember 6 months of chemotherapy. And I'm not saying this to you tonight for a pity party for myself, but I only went 1 day a week for about half an hour. And when I say half an hour, I mean that's from leaving my house to getting the chemotherapy to being done. Okay? I can remember thinking, what did I ever do to deserve this? What did I do? Right? I didn't smoke, I didn't drink, I didn't do all these things that people who are bad people get sick for doing. I can remember thinking those thoughts. So were they fair thoughts? No, but I justified them. And I want you to think, and I can remember thinking, what is it that is there? How many of you guys know where the outpatient center is now at St. Francis Hospital? Okay? Well, that's where I did chemotherapy. That's where the chemotherapy used to be done. And that's the honest truth. It brings back memories from 20-some years ago. And I can remember something else, though, that I will never forget. And that is when God said, quit having a pity party for yourself. I can remember watching people who have spent their 5th day for 8 hours in a day with chemotherapy. And my life was horrible, taking 10 minutes of chemotherapy. I can tell you about infirmities. You can tell me about infirmities in your life too, can't you? We've all had them. Some of them aren't pleasant, as pleasant as others, if you want to use that word. But in reality, infirmities come for various reasons. And in Paul here in 2 Corinthians, he's like, you know what? They're okay with me. But I want you to notice there's a qualifier there at the very end of that. I want you to notice here. He says they're okay with me only because it is for Christ's sake. It's the only reason it was okay with him. And he wasn't going to fight it. He wasn't going to hope that somebody else had what he had. And you can see this here. You can see it says, therefore, I want you to underline the word pleasure. I don't know about you, but when I think of pleasure, that means it's something that's enjoyable. Right? Something that's enjoyable. I don't know what it might be. It might be a big old Whopper from Burger King or a big old banana split from Dairy Queen. I don't know what it might be. But something that is pleasurable is usually something that we enjoy having happen to us, having in our lives. And here we see Paul. He says, you know what? I take pleasure in the nasty things that come into my life. I take pleasure in this nasty thorn in the flesh that I have. I'm just going to really say that. I'm not going to lie to you. It took a long time And maybe it never really got there fully. But you see, the reality is that Paul wants us to understand that there's going to be times in our personal lives, infirmities are going to take place. Things that really stink, things that hurt, things that just don't add up and make any sense. And he's also reminds you know what? There's also going to be times reproaches come in. And if you notice here too, that he says also too that those reproaches come in needs, in persecution. And he's reminding us of these things. He's reminded these things are going to happen. Distresses are going to come in our lives. Now, by the way, these distresses, these infirmities, and so forth and so on, this is not somebody who has to go eat at McDonald's versus at a steakhouse because a steakhouse was closed. Okay, that is not a distress. All right, this here is what he is talking about. This distress, this persecution that comes in our life, and I want you to underline those three words, for Christ's sake. Too many times we go around and have a pity party for ourselves, and we act like our life is horrible because we didn't get everything we wanted. But remember this, there's a difference between wants and needs in our country, in our lives. And you know who knows the difference between them? God. I think we've blurred the lines in our society today, what a need is versus what a want is. And we've made our wants more important than needs. But I want us to see here that he's reminding us of this. He's reminding us of these things. But then there's the phrase there at the end of that verse in 2 Corinthians, where he says, for when I am weak, then I am strong. Why is that? Why is it that God does those things to us? Lets those things happen to us, actually is a better way of putting it. Why? Because you see, you and I have to remember something. When we are weak, it channels the power, if you will, of God to flow through us to come out so people can see his strength. That's why we have to be that way. Remember, I'm not standing here tonight to tell you I love infirmities, because that would be a lie if I told you that. Okay? I don't take pleasure in infirmities the way probably I should. Probably all of us, if we're honest, we don't. In fact, I think that if we're really honest with ourselves, we forget that God lets things happen in our lives for a reason. How do you remember that little boy named Ryan White? Right? Oh, there was a lot going on when that little boy lost his life. And sometimes it's hard to imagine why and how can anything like that be used for God's glory. Over and over again, people ask that question. And how can it be used? It can be used when we actually let God have the glory. Let him have control of the circumstances. You see, as Paul writes this, he's reminding us, listen, Paul not only had people who hated him, who wanted him dead. Remember, they had to lower him out of a basket, okay, to get him away from his enemies. So he's reminding us that, you know what, these things I would rather boast about, these infirmities, because ultimately people will see my God through the infirmities in my life. That's what he was saying. And I want us to think about our lives. You know what? If all the things I'm hearing come true, what I've heard about the latest results of what took place a week and a half, a little over 2 weeks ago almost, a lot of infirmities are going to be coming the way of Christians. If what they're saying is true. And if that is true, are we to whine about it or are we to glory in it? That's the question. And you see, if we whine about it, nothing will be done for the glory of God. But if we glory in what God wants us to do, people will see God through it. See, this is what it is here that he's reminding. He's talking about, of course, of himself, but then ultimately reminding us of who God needs to be in our life. Even our strongest day is weak compared to God's power. Let us never forget that. So tonight I want to spend the rest of our time looking at adversity. Yay! Okay? Everybody go, yay, I love adversity. Yay! Okay. right, we're going to go back to Philippians chapter 1, okay? We're actually going to move around just a little bit, but I want to specifically start out in verse 12. I want you to hear what it says in Philippians chapter 12, verse 1. And let's hear what Paul, once again, great writer, okay? Listen to what he says. I want you to know why Paul was a great writer. Because he let God use him. Okay? Because he let God work through him. That's why he was who he became. That's why many great people become who they are, because they let God work through them. All right? So as we see this here, listen to verse 12. But I want you to know, okay, he wants you to know. He wants me to know, brethren, that's Christians, that's the church, that the things which happened to me have actually turned out for the furtherance of the gospel. Listen, when you read the scriptures, I want to encourage you, when he uses words like brethren, when he uses words here like things happened to me actually turn out for the furtherance of the gospel, I want you, he's talking about you, he's talking to me, he's talking to us. He's talking to us, Christian. First of all, Paul would not accept us to have a pity party for him, to feel sorry for him. Paul wants us to understand here that, brethren, these things happen, they turn out for the furtherance of the gospel. How many of you have ever been in jail before? Don't raise your hand. I know about someone in the Bible who was in jail. His name was Paul. Okay? And in fact, when Paul was in jail, there could have been a lot of bad things that could have happened to him. Am I right? And the opposite usually happened with Paul. God's people prayed for him. God's people interceded on his behalf. And guess what always happened to Paul when he was in jail? A miracle took place. Oh, by the way, I'm not talking about the miracle of him getting out of the jail, but people coming to know Jesus Christ because of his infirmities. Okay? You see, this is what it is. He's reminding us this. And I want us to remember something. The attitude that we have collectively, the attitude that we have as individuals, that attitude is something that we need to remember. What is the attitude towards our troubles that come into our lives? Because listen, we've all lived long enough to know troubles, if they haven't come, they'll come, and they'll come, and they'll come. And how we interact with those, how we allow them to become who we are, shape who we are. Are we going to take pleasure in those infirmities? Are we going to do so? And I want you to write this down, okay? What it means to take pleasure is simply this: to think well or to have the right attitude. Okay? To think well or to have the right attitude. All right? So please remember that. So let's look at this for a moment. So one of the things here, Paul says very clearly in verse 12, the first thing here is adversity promotes the progression of the gospel. Okay? That's the first thing it does. Paul says right there in verse 12, adversity promotes the furtherance of the gospel. That's exactly what he says. Now, Paul does not want us to, he doesn't sit there and go, man, I was so uncomfortable when I was in jail. I didn't get the best food that I was supposed to have. The guards talked mean to me. The guards weren't very nice to me. They didn't like me. Listen, when you go to jail, you should fully expect for the guards to be possibly giving you a hard time. When you go to jail, you shouldn't expect hip food from a 5-star restaurant. Unless you live in America. All right, nobody got that. Thank you, Donnie. So Paul understood he wasn't going to be treated as a special person. Christian, if you think for a moment the world is going to look out for your best interest, you are mistaken. Church, if we think the world cares whether or not we have Christmas services this year, we're mistaken. Listen, they've had Christmas trees up at Menards since the the first part of October. Do you think they really have that much thought on what Christmas is really about? And I was asked the person, I said, why do you guys have Christmas things up so early? And I quote, because we have no other things to put on our floors, so we'll put out the Christmas trees. Okay? You see, we need to remember this verse is going to help promote the gospel. One of the things here that we need to remember is, I know that Rick, I bet anything that you loved to study the languages of the Bible, Greek and Hebrew, because they were so easy, weren't they? I mean, they were just phenomenal, right? I knew straight A students who barely could pass Hebrew, okay? Fortunately, I didn't have to take Hebrew, so I studied Hebrew a lot, and I've studied Hebrew and so forth, but I want to share with you a Greek term tonight, okay? I want to share with you what is important here to understand here. The Greek phrase here, this Greek word translated for adversity, this Greek word translated here is reminding us of a military term. Imagine that, Paul in military terms, Paul in sports terms, okay? That Paul reminds us here and wants us to understand. This is kind of like those engineers who are preparing a road for the troops to walk on, okay? All those roads, engineers designed them. The builders had to come in and build them. And then what happened is here, they were preparing he's literally reminding us of preparing for the advancement of an army, and getting that obstacle out of the way. Took a lot of preparation. You guys ever drive through tunnels in the road? It took a lot of preparation for that tunnel to be engineered properly, to make sure the structure was high enough, make sure the span was enough, make sure the arches would hold up the weight. It took a lot of preparation to do so. But we need to remember something here. What Paul is saying, that term that we need to understand, is that when he says that adversity was there, that he was preparing the way, that he removed the barriers. Those barriers were removed for the furtherance of the gospel. Have you ever, many years ago, I don't know if I've ever told you this or not, have you ever been in an uncomfortable situation before? Never, right? Okay, just want to make sure we're all on the same page, since we never have. Jennifer and I were visiting one time in Nashville, Tennessee. And this person that we were visiting, we sat down on their couch, and you know what came out the couch? Cockroaches. Remember that, Jennifer? And the thing is, you can't go, oh my gosh, what's wrong with that person? Oh, by the way, Jesus loves you. Can't do that, okay? Can't do that. You just lost from the moment you said something. You see, one of the things that I want us to see here and to remember is that Paul's circumstances had removed barriers to the advancement of the gospel. And sometimes in your life, sometimes in my life, sometimes those obstacles come so that ultimately barriers will be removed in our life. Don't look at adversity as a horrible, nasty thing. Look at verse 13 of 1 Corinthians chapter 1. It says this. It says, so that it has become evident to the whole palace guard and to all the rest that my chains are in Christ. Put all the chains you want to on me, Paul says. Makes no difference to me, because the real one I'm bound to is Jesus Christ. That's what he said. He didn't care about those other chains that are on life, because he looked at them as an adversity. He looked at them as an opportunity. He looked at them as an opportunity for the guards to hear about Jesus. And if I remember correctly, I think the guard and some families and people came to know Christ because of that, right? You see, we need to remember this. It provides opportunity to witness. So Paul was literally chained. Okay, if you could think of somebody you'd like to be chained to for 24 hours, over a 24-hour time frame, who might that be? Okay? I promise you this, the guard at the Roman prison didn't say, I want Paul. Promise you they didn't. But guess what? Somebody had to have Paul attached to them. And that somebody, God knew who they were going to be, and that God was going to use Paul to reach him and his family. You see, he knew those things. God already knew those things were going to take place. He was there for 24 hours. Paul was chained to a Roman guard. Oh, and by the way, there were 4 shifts per day. So Paul had, you ready for this? You can write this down if you like. The whole time he was locked up in prison, he had over 3,000 opportunities to witness to the Roman soldiers. So he didn't look at adversity as a horrible thing. Verse 14 says this of 1 Corinthians 1. And most of the brethren in the Lord, having become confident by my chains, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Okay, I'm not going to lie to you this evening. I have never once participated in a riot. Okay? I've never once broke windows, tried to burn any buildings down. Have you ever tried to do that? And I bet a lot of the people who participated in those haven't either, but got sucked up in the moment. It happens. But it also happens for a good too. Did you know that? You've been around somebody who's excited, and they're excited about something that the church might be doing or happened in their life? It's a lot easier to get excited for them and with them, isn't it, when they are? See, also too here, one of the things here is that it allows us, his adversity, he had the adversity you might have in your life. It will allow us to produce courage in other people's life. It provided courage that they saw Paul, who was in chains. That they saw him in chains, and they knew that he was able to do so, they could as well. So think about that. Please remember, be careful who you choose for your friends, because they can flip you around the other way too. The fourth thing I want to see here about adversity is that sometimes here what adversity does to us, it proves the character of our friendships. Look at verse 15 down to verse 18. It says, some indeed preach Christ, even from envy and strife, and some also from goodwill. The former preach Christ from self-ambition, not sincerely, supposing to add affliction to my chains. But the latter out of love, knowing that I am appointed for the defense of the gospel. What then? Only that in every way, whether in person, in pretense or in truth, Christ is preached, and in this I rejoice. Yes, I will rejoice. You see, Paul remembers this, that, you know what? Even in these circumstances that he faced, not everybody liked Paul, wouldn't you agree? Not everybody was his best friend. But he still did not let that stop him from doing the right thing. We need to remember this character. You know, character is important. Character is so important. In fact, if you ever want to do a study on your own, and you want to do a study sometime on characters of bishops and deacons, it's very interesting. When we lived in Wyoming, everybody kept saying, it's time to choose deacons. And they'd say, well, let's find out which ones have never been divorced, because if they've never been divorced, they'll qualify. If they've been divorced, they don't qualify. You see, the reality is it's a character issue that Paul wrote to Timothy about. It's a character issue that here Paul is writing to you and I about, of who we choose to be our friends. It's a character issue. If the character is not good, we usually don't go around that person. Am I correct? You see, we need to remember character is huge. It's huge in what influences your life, what influences my life, what influences the life of the church. Character. And I'm going to tell you what, America's in trouble because we're not teaching those things anymore. We're not. Live for the day, live for yourself, and everything else will be all right. And if it's not, that's your problem. Just blame somebody else. See, character is important. If you have friendships with people, I want to encourage you, you know what, if you only have friends that are Christians, I want to encourage you to expand just a little bit, okay? I want you to be careful in so doing, but I want you to expand a little bit. Because you see, you can't win anybody to Christ if all you hang around with are Christians. Just think about that for a little bit. It's easy to hang around Christians, am I right? It is. We're supposed to. We should want to. But character is important. How about this one? Look at verse 19 and 20. For I know that this will turn out for my deliverance through your prayer and the supply of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, according to my earnest expectation and hope that in nothing I shall be ashamed, but with all boldness as always. So now also Christ will be magnified in my body, whether it be life or by death. I'm just curious, how many lives were touched by Billy Graham while he was alive? I want you to think about something else. I wonder how many lives are still being touched by Billy Graham after his passing. How many lives are still being touched by Abraham Lincoln or George Washington? Charles Spurgeon, D.L. Moody. You see, we need to remember here, he wants us to understand that adversity brings growth in our lives. And that the life or by death. That's what Paul was all about. That he didn't worry about those things. That he was about trusting in Jesus Christ. In fact, if you look at verse 20 of 1 Corinthians, I want to read it to you one more time. All right? I remember as a kid, before I read it to you, I remember as a kid, my dad used to say, hey, you want to go fishing tomorrow? When you guys remember your dad or grandpa or somebody said, let's go fishing tomorrow. I still do this today, by the way. I'm going, yes. Hope it's not too windy. But I hope the fish are biting. Okay? But I remember as a kid, I couldn't sleep at night before we go. You know what I'm talking about? You see, one of the things here that Paul wants us to understand is that we need to have an eager expectation. You know, Christian, we're way too defeated. We don't think God can do anything. Did you know that? We really don't. Deep down, we will sit there and say we do, but deep down, do we really? Do we really say, God, you can do anything? Do we really mean it, or we just do it to get people excited? It's a legitimate question I think we have to ask ourselves. Because it's important that we understand that we need to have eager expectations in our life. As I shared with you before, our missions team is putting some things together for our church. Listen, if they're putting those things together without any expectation, they're missing the whole point. Okay? Whole point. But I don't believe that's the case. I believe that when we come to church, we should have an expectation about how we can have an encounter with God. And by the way, that encounter has everything to do with you, not with me or not with Brother Donnie as the music is led. It has everything to do with us, whether we're prepared, willing, and ready to have that encounter. Okay? And here we see this. He wants us to remember this. He wants us to grow in our life. Verse 21 says this. He says this, but if I live on in the flesh, this will mean fruit from my labor. Yet what I shall choose, I cannot tell. Have you ever questioned somebody's motives? In fact, maybe you might have even questioned your own motives sometimes. Why did I do that? You see, what Paul is getting at here is that adversity purifies our motives. It purifies, makes them clean, so that we can have this experience that we want. As Rick Warren wrote so many times ago, he was right sometimes. One of those was we have a purpose. God made us for a purpose. God made his church for a purpose. And we need to remember to live as Christ and to die is gain. There's a purpose. You know, there's a purpose of why we have Sunday school. There should be. If there isn't, there should be. There should be a purpose to why we have youth group. There should be a purpose to why we have worship. There should be a purpose behind those. We have a purpose for our church. It's there. And finally, we need to remember, I want to share with you from verse 22 down to verse 26. And listen to what it says for Philippians chapter 1. It says, but if I live on in the flesh, this will mean fruit from my labor. Yet what I shall choose, I cannot tell. For I am hard pressed between the two, having a desire to depart and be with Christ, which is far better. Far better. Nevertheless, to remain in the flesh is more needful for you. And being confident of this, I know that I shall remain and continue with you all for your progress and joy of faith, that your rejoicing for me may be abundant in Jesus Christ by my coming to you again. One of the things that life gives us is an opportunity to serve God. Did you know that? That's one of the things life gives us. And this is what Paul is getting at here. That he wants us to understand that. He says, listen, I get it. Death is a lot more favorable for me. Why? Because the moment I pass from this world to the next, I'm right where I want to be. What are you saying? But he's also reminding them, you know what? The fact is, though, until that happens, the perspective here has to be that living provides more of an opportunity to serve God. This is coming from a man who had a thorn in his flesh. This is coming from a man who had adversity in his life and pain in his life. That's what he was saying. That's what I want us to learn. That Christ will come again to you and to me. But ultimately, what separates Paul from us? Have you ever thought about that? You know, when you look at the Bible, you have a lot of different writers. They were all divinely inspired by God. The Bible tells us that. But what separates them from you and from me? And that is very simply this: their desire to be used by God. That's it. Their desire to be used by God. I mean, Paul could have been like, you know what? I don't have to put up with this. I don't have to have this keep going on in my life. It wasn't divine. He had a mind. He had in mind. Now, mind, he had an interesting experience coming to know Jesus, didn't he? But nonetheless, I want us to remember that adversity, when it comes into our lives, let us look at it as an opportunity for growth, not to take steps backwards. Now, I don't know how you can do that when adversity comes into your life. That's something you have to decide. That's something you have to come to the realization of. I can't. But what I do know is that adversity will come into our lives. You know that you might be facing some right now. And when it does, what are you going to do with it? As a church, if they shut us down again, what are we going to do with that? What are we going to do? You see, those are things we have to think through. Those are things we have to ask God about. Those are things that we need to remember, that adversity makes us stronger, not weaker. No, the world around us will think it makes us weaker. It makes us stronger. Will you trust Him with that? Brother Donnie, I'm just going to close this in prayer tonight, okay? But I'd like us to take a moment. And I'd like for us to think about what adversity might you be facing in your life right now, and how are you handling it? Let's take a moment. Let's pray. Father God, you love us, and I thank you for it. Lord, as your word tells us, we're to rejoice when things come into our life that may not be pleasant. Lord, not to rejoice because we're told to the Lord, because we love you, and to learn from that adversity. I pray, Father, right now for all of us here, that any adversity we might be facing, Lord, you'll turn it around and use it ultimately so people can see you. Change our lives so that you can use us to change others. And Lord, I thank you ahead of time for what you will do. Use your church now. Bring us back here safely Wednesday, Lord, so that we may worship you. And I ask these things in your name. Amen. Thank you for coming out tonight. I sure hope we'll see everybody back here on Wednesday.